we have in the past considered the Baconian approach to knowledge. So that is when we assume that the ancient take on knowledge, this idea that you need rock solid justifications that can stop any kind of skeptical argumentation. Francis Bacon says, yeah, forget all that noise. That we don't need to do that at all. The way that Bacon conceived of knowledge is much more pragmatic. What is knowledge? It's information that you can apply in practice, information that can help you alleviate human suffering. So if you like that, well then, hey, maybe you're a Baconian. But you know what? There are other views around in the 1600s in Western Europe. Maybe take a look at some of those first before we really make up our mind here. So today we're going to look at, or begin to look at, the view of a man named Rene Descartes. And in fact, today we'll look at his negative project when he's kind of taking apart beliefs. So we'll do that. But before we get into that, I want to set this up a little bit with some historical context. I really am stressing historical context, and I think I have good reasons for it. Here, listen up and tell me if you think this is a good idea. So if I don't remind you that we are in the middle of an epistemic crisis here in the 17th century, it looks like worrying about skepticism, it's just like a game that epistemological philosophers play when they're quote unquote doing philosophy. Because if you live in a time where you feel that knowledge is secure and, we know what we know and it's not going to really change, then yeah, skepticism kind of looks like, a pastime. Arguing against skepticism looks like a pastime. So maybe that's true for you. Maybe you think that everything is honky-dory right now, epistemically speaking. Let me, I guess I'll make a comment about that in a second. But in the 1600s, as I've stressed over and over again, that is not the case, right? They are moving away from the Aristotelian worldview. And that was, the way that everyone thought for like 2,000 years. And so it's going to be a little bit unnerving to say, okay, now how do we think about knowledge? So that was going on. And let me make my comment here. Some people think that we are currently, once again, going through an epistemic crisis. What is knowledge now, right? Let me give you some buzzwords: fake news, alternative facts. What really does make what we know justified? What justifies our knowledge claims? How come some people can say, well, I believe this because of this, and you think that that is like a conspiracy theory? So how can we ground our conception of knowledge so that it can resolve the tensions that I think a lot of us feel right now? Some people think certain things are facts, and, it seems to not be a fact. So maybe we are currently in an epistemic crisis of our own. And so you can kind of, sympathize with what was going on in the 1600s. They weren't sure what counts as knowledge anymore. Everything is okay, epistemically speaking. If everything is okay, epistemically speaking, you don't really think about this. But when you can't agree on what the truth is, well, that's when, okay, so how do we know what we know? That's when these questions really start. Okay, well, that's one point that I wanted to make. Here's another one. I think it'll it's adjacent, but in the past, societal advancements were often accompanied by backtracking. And why is this relevant? Well, again, if things are going honky dory, you don't really worry about like, how do you know what you know? But if things are not going great, then yeah, you want to know, how do we fix it? And the way you come to a conclusion as to how you fix it is that you have to have the same shared epistemic norms. So I'll explain all that in a second. Let me talk about something that doesn't seem relevant, but I had a very crappy car when I was in my late teens, a high degree of crapulence, we might say. And I actually got quite good at fixing cars because of how bad my car was. And so what I mean by this is the fact that, you keep coming into recurring problems actually makes it so that you learn how to fix things. Well, in a society where you have a lot of problems arising, you have to figure out how to come up with practical solutions on the fly, right? You have to be ready for that kind of thing. And that's exactly what was happening, honestly, through most of human history. New problems arise and they're really, really bad. And people have to figure out, how do we figure out a solution? And figuring out solutions often entails, actually, I'm going to say almost always entails, in the very least, beginning with agreeing on what the facts of the matter are. And so epistemology was very relevant in the 17th century. And I'm going to go ahead and say it. It's still relevant today, right? It's the case that whenever things aren't, socially speaking, very friendly, when there's hostility between different camps and different people hold on to different ways of believing and different sets of facts, what we have there is an epistemic conflict. And that's why epistemology is very useful. So we had spoken that we are in the Tudor period, and for the most part, that was a period of stability in England, at least. But we have mentioned various times that this was also a time period where there was a kind of conflict, lots of religious conflict and persecution. One person we haven't spoken about before is Giordano Bruno. Bruno believed that not only did he accept the heliocentric model of the solar system, he also believed that the stars are themselves suns that probably have their own planets orbiting them. And so there's probably other humans in those other, or not necessarily humans, but other living creatures on those planets revolving around those suns. And so very interesting ideas from Giordano Bruno over 400 years ago. Well, the authorities, the religious authorities of the time, did not take kindly to his views because, well, it didn't line up with the Bible. He was burned at the stake. So that is something that I hope anyone listening to this would say, yeah, you shouldn't kill people for having different hypotheses than yours. Academic freedom is something that, basically makes the university system work. And if someone had different ideas, the way to respond to them is through rational argumentation, through evidence, that kind of thing. So that is not good. Things are not honky-dory. Another thing that was going on elsewhere in Europe is that famine struck in Russia. Famine has been a persistent problem for humanity for I don't know, if humans have been around 200,000 years, 199,600 years, it's been a problem. there is a whole idea called the Great Escape, where we finally escape from famine and disease and all that. So Russian famine strikes. It is very, very bad. And so people need to know, what could we have done to avoid this? How do we know what we know, right? How do we know which plan of action can, successfully avoid this situation in the future? We've already mentioned the 30 Years' War many, many times. This is obviously an atrocious conflict, and it had a lot to do with beliefs, right? So some people had a certain set of beliefs about what it meant to be a Christian, and other people had a different set of beliefs. And that's at least one of the reasons why they fought it out, and millions died. So there is yet another problem that arises because of beliefs. And, well, this one isn't necessarily because of beliefs, or not as directly at least, but let me just call this a threat multiplier. The thing with the plague, the bubonic plague, is that it keeps coming. It's if anyone's familiar here with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's not that, it hits once and then it goes away. You build immunity and it goes away. No, it's not like that. It comes in waves. And so you can see in the COVID-19 pandemic that hospitalizations go up and then they go down. And so that's kind of the deal, right? It goes up and down, and, you have to live with that for a decade sometimes. So that was the exact same thing with the bubonic plague. It would come, it would go, and that just makes things, there's an underlying tension to your existence, right? So not good for epistemic matters. Well, all of this was going on, and so you can see that beliefs matter. Inquiring as to how it is that we form our beliefs, that matters. And so several philosophers and intellectuals began to focus on something that they felt they might be able to affect, right? They were thinking, okay, we got so many problems here. At least some of them are arising because of this: religious convictions. So that is one thing that they began to try to address. Now we're going to talk about two people in particular: Rene Descartes and John Locke. Locke we will talk about in the next lesson. But what they were noticing is that religious fanatics, they reasoned just as well as the best logicians. If you take a symbolic logic course, you learn about modus ponens and modus tollens. Well, they were able to make those kinds of arguments, these religious fanatics, just like anyone else, right? Just like a well-bred logician. So what is going on here? What is the problem? Why do they arrive at such harmful and cruel conclusions, such as it is justified to harm people that don't believe exactly what I believe? Well, Descartes and Locke, in their own ways, realized that the problem was that people began with religious assumptions that they understood to be a universal truth. In other words, their logic was just fine. It's simply the case that they had some dogmas in there, some unquestioned truths that were mucking up the whole reasoning. If you start from dubious starting points, right? If you have in there really false beliefs that you cannot question, well, from there you are able to justify all kinds of horrible things, like the killing of heretics, the torture of witches, and of course, holy war. And so this is how we're going to begin to get into the topic of today's lesson. The year, my friends, is 1640. And the person in question is Rene Descartes. So Descartes has many hats, and most people that we'll be covering wear many hats because, well, there was no professional philosophers yet, right? That took some time. But in this case, Descartes was a philosopher, a mathematician, a scientist. He was also a mercenary of sorts. He was a paid soldier that fought in one of the religious conflicts that we've talked about. I think he was in the artillery, which means that he would measure the trajectory of cannonballs and kind of help people aim the cannonballs. In any case, he is famous for a couple of things. I'm going to mention his Cartesian coordinates. If you ever took a geometry class, you know that there's the X and Y graph, right? Those are Cartesian coordinates. It's a way to combine algebra and geometry. So that's actually Descartes, right? He was very famous in his day for his mathematical accomplishments. He is also going to provide for us a different epistemic theory, a new epistemic theory. So let's get into that right now. Let me begin with this. It's kind of an overall, eagle-eye view of the Cartesian project. So Descartes believed that our premises must be more certain than our conclusions. What that means is that we must move from propositions that we have more confidence in to those that we have less confidence in, at least initially, before argumentation. What does all that mean? Essentially, unlike the religious fanatics that Descartes was critiquing in his own way, he thinks you should start with not very dubious, religious dogmas, but instead with things that you know for sure. And based on those things that you know for sure, you can establish your other beliefs. And that's how you justify your claims. You start with what you know with 100% certainty, and then go from there. Okay, that sounds great, right? So a very unique idea, maybe? Not quite. It's actually the case that Aristotle made a very similar point 2,000 years prior to this in a work known as the Posterior Analytics. That's why typically I refer to this principle as the dictum of Aristotle or Aristotle's dictum. And I definitely think that we should kind of, give credit to both of these thinkers because Aristotle is using this principle in his own way for his own goals. What Descartes is doing is something very important here because he's taking these principles from Aristotle and using them in novel ways for his historical context. So among the many things that Descartes is doing here, he's going to argue against circular reasoning. So what is that? There's an informal fallacy known as begging the question. What that basically means, if I can give you a semi-formal definition, is whatever it is that you're trying to argue for, you basically just assume that it's true. Now that's obviously, gobbledygook. It sounds crazy to even try to argue in that way. Well, let me give you an example so you can see that sometimes people accidentally slip into this. So let's just say that someone says, hey, I believe that God exists. Very cool. There's a conclusion, right? So you ask them, well, how do you know that? Well, because it says so in the Bible, which is true. Okay, cool. All right. So because it says in the Bible and the Bible is true, that's how you know that God exists. Oh, and how do you know that what's in the Bible is true? And then they respond, oh, well, that's because it came from God who exists. In other words, you're justifying your belief that God exists through the Bible, and you're justifying your belief in the Bible through God. So that is hopelessly circular reasoning. I hope you can tell. And not only is it circular reasoning, but it seems to be fairly evident that it's impossible to refute that. If you already believe those two things, and that's how you defend them, you're just going to go around in circles. So not only is your defense of it circuitous, but it might be the case that you're kind of stuck in a loop. There's no way to disconfirm what you believe. That's a more psychological point that I'm making there, but I don't know, it is true. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make here is that Descartes is not an Aristotelian, but he is using Aristotelian ideas to paradoxically help overturn the Aristotelian worldview. And I love this, right? This is something that we see, throughout the history of philosophy, not only Western philosophy, Aztec philosophy, Eastern philosophy, whatever. You hear what wise people have to say, and you're allowed to disagree, but you don't toss it all out. You kind of mine through it for the good ideas, and you keep those and you keep using them. And based on those good ideas that still, stand up to rational scrutiny, you build off of those, and that's how progress comes. So I like it. That's a really good thing there. Anyway, all of this has been very abstract. Let's get a little more concrete. I like to give metaphors whenever possible for, philosophical projects. And if I had to give a metaphor for Descartes' project, it's basically that of a building. Now, I hope you come up with your own metaphor for this. It will be very useful in your understanding. But I like the building because when you make a building or a house or whatever, you have to lay the foundation first. And upon that foundation, you build the rest of your house or building or whatever. So here, Descartes is basically saying, look for those beliefs that you know with certainty. That's your foundation. And then you can stack up the rest of your beliefs. Now, if some beliefs don't end up fitting in that structure you're making, well, I don't know, don't believe those. But always start with what you know for sure. Okay. Well, then, if that metaphor works for you, and I hope it does, what is your foundation? How do you know those beliefs that you know for sure? For this, Descartes uses what is typically known as the method of doubt, aka hyperbolic doubt. I kind of like that phrase, hyperbolic doubt. And his goal was to disabuse himself of anything he didn't know with absolute certainty. Okay, it's time to get technical. We want to have some jargon for all of this. So far, we just kind of been speaking of it somewhat loosely. So the project in general, the approach, is known as foundationalism. And this is a view that some beliefs are foundational. They don't need to be justified. They are, in a way, self-justifying or self-evident or self-authenticating, if you like these phrases. Basically, you don't need to justify them further. They sort of, are, I don't want to say obvious. Self-evident does kind of mean obvious, right? But they can serve as stops to the regress, right? You don't have to keep justifying these. These beliefs are just kind of where the buck stops, right? They're self-evident. You don't have to go any further. And it is upon these foundational beliefs that you can build up the rest of your beliefs. And so this is how Descartes justifies knowledge claims. And in effect, what Descartes is doing is he's taking this idea from, Plato, the JTB theory of knowledge, which Plato may or may not have believed. And, that is vulnerable to skeptical argumentation. So what he does is provide a new take on how to justify claims that isn't vulnerable to the regress argument. So here is the infinite regress argument that we have covered in the past. And Descartes is basically blocking this argument by blocking premise number 3. Premise number 3 reads, in order to justifiably believe something, You must believe it on the basis of an infinite amount of good reasons. Well, Descartes is saying, nope, that's not true. There are some beliefs that you don't have to further justify. And if you get down to those beliefs, then you stop the infinite regress. Let's just say that you have belief A, and they say, oh, the skeptics are here, and they're like, yeah, well, how do you know belief A? And you say, well, B, C, and D. And they ask, well, how do you know B, C, and D? And you say E through G and H through whatever, right? And then eventually you get to belief Z. And they say, well, how do you justify Z? And you say, well, Z is a foundational belief. It is self-evident. That's it. You can't question it. And you can even, tell the skeptic, try to question this belief. How can you possibly doubt this? And hopefully you stump them. And boom, the infinite regress is gone. Okay, the method of doubt is, well, here's what it might look like in practice. It's not exactly what Descartes did, but basically you consider a belief, whatever you want, and then try to doubt it. And if that belief allows for any possibility of doubt, discard, toss. You don't need it. It is not a foundational belief. Repeat a lot. And whatever is left over at the end of all of that, boom, that you know with certainty. That's a foundational belief. Let's go over examples of what are totally not foundational beliefs, right? This is, as I mentioned earlier, the destructive phase of Descartes' philosophy. He's basically getting rid of beliefs right now. So we have the belief that I know where I parked my car. How about that? That is my car right there, as you can tell. I drive very expensive sports cars. I'm kidding. I don't. So let's pretend this is my car. And let's pretend that I'm saying to myself, I know where I parked my car. Now, if you have ever been mistaken about where you parked your car, even once, you cannot, at least rationally, be 100% certain as to where you parked your car. You have to allow for at least a little bit of doubt. At most, you can have 99.4% confidence or something, right? So that is, and that's for me. I hardly ever forget where I parked my car. My mom basically 100% of the time forgets where she parked the car. So it might depend on different people. Here is the point. You can't be 100% certain that you know this. Everyone, I'm suspecting, has made that mistake at least once. Or how about this one? Do you know where your ID is? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. If you have ever misplaced your ID or thought you had it when you didn't, then that's not a foundational belief. I know where my ID is. That cannot be a foundational belief, right? I actually know someone who tried to go somewhere where you have to be 21 and over and just forgot their ID. Like numerous times they've forgotten their IDs and can't get into where they want to get into. Where is your debit card? I know one person, me, who went to the store, grabbed a bunch of stuff and, was ready to ring him up, only to realize that me, didn't have any way to pay for things. You're lucky now. Now you can basically pay for things with your smartphone, but back in those days, you needed actual money or some kind of, card or cash or something. So if you've ever forgotten your ID or your debit card or where you parked your car, these can't be foundational beliefs. I hope you're noticing that basically, if it's possible for you to be wrong about it and you've been wrong in the past, you can't call these foundational beliefs. They're not something that you know with 100% certainty. These are not the kind of thing that could serve as a foundational belief. And I'm not sure that I would want to, right? So how do you base the rest of your beliefs? I know where my ID is. Like that's a ridiculous foundational belief, right? So not only are they not foundational beliefs, but you wouldn't even want them to be. They're kind of, just kind of whatever knowledge claims, not terribly important knowledge claims, non-foundational knowledge claims. One more, why not? Do you know how much money is in your account right now? I can tell you with a high degree of confidence that I have no idea how much money I have in there. And you're probably the same. Even if you just checked, I've been wrong after I just checked. So that is also not a foundational belief. Nonetheless, you're getting the point. Descartes here is getting rid of most beliefs. He's saying, yeah, that's not a foundational belief. That is, no, not that. Yeah. So he's going to keep continuing to do this. And eventually, he would discover foundational beliefs. And it is upon those foundational beliefs that he will eventually build the rest of his worldview. As I mentioned earlier, though, he did not do this exactly the way that we went over right now. He was a little bit more judicious than that. He didn't go one belief at a time and, discard or whatever. It was in, big jumps that he took. And he did this through some very famous arguments. So let's move into those arguments now. So now we're going to move into Descartes' actual arguments. But I think I'm going to give you a little bit of context here because it'll help you understand them, at least by the end of the next lesson. The historical context that I'm going to give you right now will be very, very helpful. So I guess that just means that we have to get into story time, right? Cool. Well, I mentioned before that Aristotle was, the Aristotelian worldview, I should say, was collapsing. And Descartes definitely wanted to help bring that along in the sense that he was defending the new science, right? He liked the new science. So that's definitely part of his project. Another reason, of course, that we already mentioned is that he thought some people had religious convictions that were disastrously, flawed and leading to harm and leading to anti-scientific concerns. So that's another reason why he did that. And here are some other potential reasons. Once you see all the reasons that motivated Descartes to embark on his project, then you can really see, okay, I see what he's doing. Okay. So another thing that Descartes was probably doing, to be honest, is trying to avoid arrest. And while he was at it, why the heck not? He was going to reconcile reason and religion so that being religious is highly compatible with investigating the natural world, doing what he was doing, right? Mathematics, science, physics, whatever. So these are some other reasons why Descartes engaged in the undertaking that he engaged in. And to help talk about all of this, let's talk about Galileo Galilei. So Galileo is, the man needs no introduction, right? He is uber famous. And what he defended. He defended the heliocentric model of the solar system. The dialogue, or the work that we should talk about, is his dialogue concerning two chief world systems. That is a dialogue in which he tries to popularize this heliocentric model. But Galileo was a little bit, how should I say this? He was a little forceful, and maybe he lacked tact a little bit. Obviously, it's a dialogue, right? So, and there's two main characters, and one of them is eventually made to look like an idiot. And it is the side of the church that was defending the geocentric model. And so that is, there's ways to go about things. And maybe that was the right thing for him to do. Maybe not. I don't know. That's another discussion altogether. What would you do, I guess, is a good question here. You're right. You have the data to back you up. And the other side is just being very recalcitrant. What would you do? In any case, so that was one thing that was, as I mentioned earlier, just kind of lacking tact. There was other aspects of his work, though, that were very shocking to people. I have here a quote from the historian of mathematics and mathematician, I should add, Maurice Klein. So it's a kind of a long quote, but I like Maurice Klein, so I'm going to give you this quote here. Whereas the Aristotelians had talked in terms of qualities such as earthiness, fluidity, rigidity, essences, natural places, natural and violent motion, potentiality, actuality, and purpose, Galileo not only introduced an entirely new set of concepts, but chose concepts which were measurable so that their measures could be related by formulas. Let me pause here. First of all, we did talk about the Aristotelian worldview, and everything was about functions, right? The function of Earth is to go to the center, and air goes up, and whatever. So that gets replaced by Galileo by things that are measurable. So this is a rapid jump. There was no transition. There wasn't like, in between this way of thinking, maybe we can think about it like this. No, he's like, here's this old way of thinking, and forget that. Here's a better way of thinking. It was quite aggressive, I guess, intellectually aggressive. Let me continue here with the quote. Some of its concepts, such as distance, time, speed, acceleration, force, mass, and weight, are, of course, familiar to us, and so the choice does not surprise us. But to Galileo's contemporaries, these choices, and in particular their adoption as fundamental concepts, were startling. Yes, indeed. Clearly, this kind of an abrupt change of systems was disorienting for several of the thinkers of the time. There's kind of a speed limit on, change sometimes, right? It's kind of too sudden for people. You almost kind of have to wait a generation for the changes to really take hold. In any case, Galileo was uber famous, and so his work spread quickly, and it was not very friendly at times. And well, wouldn't you know it, the Inquisition, if you don't know what the Inquisition is, it's the institution of the Roman Catholic Church that just goes ahead and concerns itself with right beliefs, right? You have to believe the correct things. And if you speak contrary to the official doctrine, well, then you're a blasphemer, right? So, or a heretic, even worse. So the Inquisition condemns Galileo to house arrest. That was actually not their first choice. They wanted to kill him. But because he is Galileo, people were like, you can't kill Galileo. Sorry. And so they didn't kill him. But he did spend the rest of his life in house arrest. I bet you didn't know that about Mr. Galileo. So that is terrible. And if you are Descartes, seeing all this, and you are trying to do the same kind of science and mathematics that Galileo is engaging in, well, then that makes you a little nervous, right? Yeah, it would make me nervous. By the way, if you ever go to Italy, and I think it's in Florence, there is, a museum. I think it's Galileo's old house, where you can actually see his middle finger pointed in the direction of the Vatican. I don't know if that's true. I hope it's true. I hope very much it's true. But yeah, so very interesting here that, I don't know. Go check it out. Okay, so it is the case that Descartes was aware of all this that was going on. He was a younger man at the time, but he was aware of it. So he wanted to find a way to do science without getting in trouble. Further, let me give you more of a quote here from Maurice Klein. Because he had a critical mind and because he lived at a time when the world outlook, which had dominated Europe for 1,000 years, was being vigorously challenged, Descartes could not be satisfied with the tenets so forcibly and dogmatically pronounced by his teachers and other leaders. So what Descartes was really realizing here is that it's a problem that people just kind of believe things not for the right philosophical foundations, not because they had philosophical foundations for them, but just because, the institution, the authorities decided, that's what we have to believe, and that's it. So he didn't like that, and we had already mentioned that before. And here's one more element here. Moreover, he felt all the more justified in his doubts when he realized that he was in one of the most celebrated schools of Europe and that he was not an inferior student. At the end of his course of study, he concluded that all his education had advanced him only to the point of discovering man's ignorance. So a lot of things contributing to Descartes going and doing the project that he did. He wanted to make science safe from religion, right? Reconcile the two. And he was noticing that if you don't do this, if you just dogmatically believe things, that leads to harm. And he was also noticing that he wasn't a dummy and that this was a project that needed to happen, right? He felt that humanity was in a state of ignorance. They were still getting mad about, you don't believe exactly what I believe. There's got to be a better method and system and way to do things. And that's what he was trying to do. I guess I want to say one more thing here. I don't have a slide for this, but he was not just doing what Galileo was doing. He didn't just want to do science. There's something even further going on with Descartes, because Galileo was challenging the external authorities of the time, right? For not getting with the times and looking at data. And so that's Galileo's project. But Descartes was doing something else. He was attempting to find a method, a philosophical foundation that could never be silenced. Not by the Inquisition, not by any institution. Because he was trying to find a method by which he can defend reason and rationality and scientific inquiry in the individual's own mind, right? With things that you cannot doubt, that you can discover for yourself. So Descartes definitely doing something different here, and all of that will make way more sense by the time that we see what Descartes was working on. So let's move in that direction now. These are Descartes' arguments. As I mentioned, he doesn't go belief by belief, figuring out whether it is a foundational belief or not. He does things in a much more judicious way. And let me begin with his very first argument. From his, so he has meditations, plural. This is from the first meditation. It's usually known as the argument from the senses. And here is more or less what Descartes says. In the past, my senses have deceived me. Hence, no sensory information is fully reliable. Remember what I said earlier about your car? If you even once forgot where you parked it, then the belief of, where your car is, that cannot serve as a foundational belief. Well, what Descartes is saying here is that your senses have lied to you in the past. Maybe not lied, that's actually what he's saying, but lied is maybe too strong of a word, but you've been mistaken from sensory information. And if you want to look at an example, there's visual illusions, there's auditory hallucinations, whatever, right? Maybe you see someone that you think you know and you wave, but it's not them. And then you pretend that you weren't waving, you were just combing your hair or something, right? You have been wrong when it comes to sensory information in the past. And so what Descartes is saying is that means that sensory information, things that you learn from your eyes and ears and taste and whatever, that cannot be foundational knowledge. It's not the kind of thing that would serve well as a rock solid foundation for the rest of our beliefs. Okay, typically when I provide this argument for students, I get a response that's more or less lackluster. And, if I'm going to paraphrase what my students have said in the past, that's too extreme. Yeah, our senses are mostly reliable, so we can still trust our senses. Okay, you're not sold yet. Even Descartes wasn't sold yet, so he gives another argument. The argument from dreams. Descartes says something like, in the past, I've been deceived by my dreams. Moreover, there's no reliable way of checking if I'm dreaming. So I can't tell whether or not I'm dreaming right now. Hence again, no sensory information is fully reliable. Okay, what's going on here? Well, it's definitely the case that I think you, just like me, have been deceived by your dreams. I'll give you my own personal examples. I have dreamt all kinds of nonsense. Like, it's honestly embarrassing. I can't believe I'm going to share what I'm about to share right now. I've dreamt that, that the sky is water, that I live on a floating island and I look down from it and it's just sky. I have dreamt that I'm in an episode of X-Files. I dreamt I was in an episode of I Love Lucy. I don't even like I Love Lucy. I don't know why I had that dream. One time, I dreamt I had Magneto's powers, meaning I can control metal. And so what I did is I opened up a body shop. And people would come in with their, dents in their car, and I was just going to zoom and fix it. And so that's what I dream. And during the dream, I'm totally like, oh yeah, I'm Magneto, for sure. That's crazy. But that is indeed what I believed at the time. Moreover, there's no way to check that I'm dreaming or not. Now, some people have told me that there is a way to check, and they'll say things like, yeah, you just, try to read. You can't read in a dream. But I can. I don't know if you just don't read enough. I can definitely read in dreams. I can tell the time in dreams. Throw whatever you want at me. I feel like I've done it in a dream. And what that means is that even if your method works once in a while, it isn't foolproof. And again, what are we looking for here? Foolproof foundational beliefs. So yeah, you don't know with 100% certainty, Descartes would say, that you're not dreaming right now. which leads me to the next point. You have weird dreams if you're dreaming right now. Anyway, so again, Descartes is trying to say no sensory information is fully reliable. Now, the typical response to this argument is a little more serious. They're like, okay, I'm paying attention now. And students will even say to me, okay, sensory information may be a little sus. Okay, I'll give you that. But our senses still serve a function, right? They can verify things we know from pure reason, things like mathematical laws. So this is kind of a contrived example I'm going to give you, but you know about the commutative law, right? Of addition, multiplication, that kind of stuff. You know, for example, that 2 times 5 is the same as 5 times 2. Cool. I hope you do. This is what you might call a mathematical law or something that you know from pure reason. You just kind of think about it and you say, yeah, that's true. And then what your senses do, like your eyes, is that they help you figure that out, right? They help you verify that. So now with your eyes, you can, count apples on the screen and you can pair them in 2 rows of 5 or 5 rows of 2. And it's the same amount of apples. So there you go. Your senses do serve a function here. So maybe this argument is interesting, but there's still, to a lot of people, something that the senses can do. They can verify what we know from pure reason. Now, I gave you this example because what not everyone knows is that you can't actually do that in linear algebra. There's actually some versions of mathematics where it's not commutative. Multiplication is not commutative, actually. And so you can even doubt, Descartes is going to say, what you think you know from pure reason. So let me give you this argument now, because Descartes is going big. He's saying, no, I think I can even doubt truths known from pure reason, right? Things like mathematical laws. All right, let's look at his very famous evil demon argument. Here's the first part of it. If it is possible that an evil demon developed an artifice to deceive me, then my sensory knowledge and even truths known from pure reason can be doubted. All right, let's just, sit with this for a minute. In the past, whenever you wanted a really powerful entity, now we use computers, right? Now we think, imagine a supercomputer. But in the past, the best that they can do is evil demons. That's why Descartes is using an evil demon. Although there is another reason, and I'll tell you about that in the next lesson. But imagine a super powerful demon, and imagine, I guess, that you believe in demons too. And they built a big contraption. That's what an artifice means. A big maze, let's just say, just for you. And in this maze, you think you're living, the real reality, but all of it has been designed to deceive you. My analogy is to a movie that you've probably never watched. It's called The Truman Show. And what happens in the movie is that there is a gentleman named Truman, and he is the only person in this, very complex reality TV show. He's the only actor, I guess I should say, in this reality TV show. And he lives in a whole community that's been designed to just get him to do interesting things so that people can watch him at home. But he doesn't know that it's all make-believe. Everyone except him is an actor. So he, his best friend is a paid actor. His, all his romances throughout his life were paid actresses, right? So none of it is actually true. Everything that he thought was true, was the case about his life, is a lie, or in some sense, not quite what he expected. That's kind of the situation with the evil demon, except even worse, right? You live in some spell where you think that what you're seeing is reality, but maybe you don't have a body. Maybe you do have a body, but it's not at all what you think it looks like. Maybe even math itself, you've been put under that spell so that 2 plus 2, you say it equals 4, but no, it doesn't. I mean, stranger things have happened, right? As I mentioned earlier, the law of commutation doesn't work in some versions of mathematics. You can't say 2 times 5 is the same as 5 times 2 in some other kinds of math. So maybe an evil demon is lying to you about everything, literally everything. Well, if that's possible, then you can't trust your senses. You can't even trust what you think is mathematical law. The next question, of course, is that even possible? Descartes says, well, how do you know it's not possible? Again, he believed in angels and demons and all of the above, right? So for him, it is possible that an evil demon is currently deceiving you. And so you don't have 100% certainty in what you are seeing and what you believe about mathematics. Therefore, sensory knowledge and even truths known from pure reason can be doubted. Did Descartes just get rid of basically every belief? Maybe. So this is my first pass at this argument, and I hope that persuaded you. That's sort of how Descartes argues for it. A lot of people, though, a lot of students aren't immediately sold on this. And don't worry, we'll do a second pass on this argument, but maybe I'll get a little help from a more contemporary philosopher. Maybe we need to pump our intuitions, so we need a little bit of technological sophistication. Let's consider this argument again. So this time, let's imagine that rather than an evil demon deceiving us, let's consider the possibility that we are currently in a simulation.